She didn't just break barriers, she shattered them. Ronda Rousey was a storm in a world that had forgotten women could fight like hurricanes. With every armbar, she didn't just win, she inspired. A champion, a movement, a force that showed the world what was possible. But greatness always demands a price. The cage takes its toll on the body, on the mind. For Ronda, the rise was meteoric and the fall inevitable. The shadow of head trauma lingered. The end came too soon. Her story is triumph and tragedy, a singular legend who left her mark forever. This is Ronda Rousey. Welcome to Deeper into the Cage.
Welcome, friends, to my home studio. My name is Robin Black. This is Deeper into the Cage. We take a look under the hood. We dig a little bit deeper into some of these episodes of Vice's dark side of the cage. I got to work on the series, so I hope to share some little extra insights with you. Today, we are looking at Ronda Rousey. This wild episode. We're going to dig in a little bit. We're going to talk to Ronda's coach, Edmund Tarverdyan. And you think you know something about him if you're an MMA fan? Some memes and quotes and little moments you've seen. He's nothing like you think. He's going to surprise you a lot. We're also going to talk to Dr. Faisal Rahman, who is himself a professional fighter, and he is a cage-side physician at UFC events. We're going to talk to him about concussions and brain trauma as it relates to Ronda and in fighting in general. So thank you for hanging with me. This is Deeper into the Cage, Ronda Rousey. Let's take a quick look at the trailer for Ronda Rousey, Dark Side of the Cage.
Ronda Rousey,
first female champion of the UFC.
she's the one going on The Tonight Show.
Every fight that she won, she finished. Why would this be any different?
I couldn't believe that Ronda Rousey could lose the fight.
It was a moment of this silence.
I didn't see that happening.
It was too much.
If you do this sport, you're going to get concussed.
That's a lot of brain trauma.
Ronda hid the fact that she experienced these concussions.
It was very tough because I made a promise.
What was the promise?
That she'll never lose.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.
We're going to talk to Edmund Tarverdyan today, Ronda's coach. Like I mentioned, you think you have an idea, you know something about him. He's nothing like you think, and that's why I'm excited for people to see. But before we dig into it, I want to talk to you about why Ronda Rousey actually is the greatest female fighter of all time. Certainly the most important female fighter of all time, and I'm going to do my best to kind of lay out an argument as to what she is, what she's done, and why it's so important. Before we dig into her fighting, there's no women in the UFC if it's not for Ronda Rousey. Would it have happened 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later? Maybe, but we have no idea. She was the definitive turning point that Dana White had said women will never fight in the UFC, ever, and then one day they did. And now women are on, they share cards, co-mains and mains. They get paid the same by all accounts, which isn't great money, let's be honest, but they get paid the same. So without Ronda, none of these women are in this position. Again, we can't see the future from that point in time. Would it have happened eventually? Perhaps. So we know that, and I think most people acknowledge that. The thing that not everybody agrees on is Ronda's sort of place in sort of the greatness as fighting evolves. So at the time she was fighting, women fighting was not at the same level as men. Not because of gender, but because of money, right? If women are not fighting in the UFC, and they're not fighting on the highest levels, and they're not sharing main cards with people, coaches are not investing as much time because there's not as much money. The environment is not investing. There's just no money in it, right? So the women who were pioneers, and there are many, and we appreciate them greatly, the women that were pioneers in it fought despite the fact that they made far less money, had no UFC potential, didn't have this giant thing to strive for. So in that time, as a result of those things, there was less mental resources, less gym resources, less coaching resources dedicated to women fighting. So the women's game, because of that, was not at the same level as the men. Ronda walks into this environment, and it's very similar in its path to original UFC. Royce Gracie comes along. Royce wasn't the biggest. Royce wasn't the best striker. Nobody looks back and judges Royce because he dominated at a point where people weren't as good in one area as him. And Ronda comes along, and it's the exact same path, the exact same process. She steps into this arena, she steps into this organism, this ecosystem that is not as advanced, and she's far ahead of them, right? Why is she ahead of them? Because from the time she's a young child, she's a driven combat athlete. Yes, there were other driven women combat athletes who had been training since they were young, but none as driven, none as hungry, none as fierce to accomplish these things as her, or they would have come already. So she existed in a time where she was the best in the organism at the time. We don't look back and go, well, Babe Ruth never hit 110-mile-an-hour fastball or whatever. I don't know anything about baseball. I'm giving you a flawed analogy. But we don't look back at periods and say, somehow these great athletes were not, or great performers or great whatever, were not the greatest. We don't look back at tech and say, Google wasn't the greatest search engine because they didn't have AI. This is very similar. Ronda was the greatest of the era, the lifelong athlete with a mentality to be able to go in and destroy and take what she wanted and pioneer a path. And she had the skills to be able to go in and take a hold of somebody, rip them to the ground, and tear their arm off. The fact that the organism of fighting and women fighting hadn't evolved to the point where they could defend that is not a detriment to Ronda. She could only become dominant in the environment she lived in. For me, the most fascinating part of the Ronda Rousey story is when individual women fighters and the organism of women fighting as a whole had evolved further and she was defeated. It was as a direct result of her. Okay, bear with me. Ronda is so dominant and so skilled and has so much influence and star power that she then draws money and coaching and attention to women's fighting, which then explodes. As a direct result of this explosion, influx of money and coaching and attention and an advanced evolution that happened, she eventually lost. All of that happened because of her. She made fighting big enough that it could then evolve quick enough to then defeat her. She was essentially, through the creation of what we now know as this machine that is women's MMA, through her influence to create it, it evolved so quickly, it was able to defeat her. So by being dominant, skilled, driven, and ultimately famous enough to make this happen, she was the cause through which it happened and evolved so quickly that she was able to be defeated. So it's a fascinating, fascinating story. Her moment in the giant, lifelong, forever map of, flow chart of fighting, her little blip in it, advanced female fighting, money, combat sports, all of these things so quickly, it actually allowed her to burn bright enough for it to happen and then defeat her, which is a wild, wild place in history. For me, it is weird and sad that people who would listen to this thesis, I'm not tooting my own horn, but this is what I do for decades. I've studied these things and have all of these pieces of information in sort of a examination of the whole flow chart. You could hear me lay this out for you, unbiased, and automatically disagree. Because for some reason, some people just despise her. They loved her. Nobody was more loved than Ronda Rousey. And then she was despised for some reason. Some say it's personal, some say it's behavior, but I mean, the same behavior. I'll leave it with this, and then we'll get to Edmund, and we'll get to Dr. Faisal to talk about concussions, and concussions were a big part of Ronda's story. Bruce Lee gets made fun of by who's that film? Quentin Tarantino. In his movie. And Quentin Tarantino comes out and talks about how Bruce Lee was arrogant, and Quentin Tarantino talks about how Bruce Lee mistreated people on sets, and Bruce Lee had an ego, all of these things. And Shannon, Bruce's daughter, of course, offended, not only because it's her father and a lifelong dedication to his art, but quite rightly, she's like, some guy is talking about the first Chinese man ever to break into Hollywood. Can you imagine how hard that is? Nobody had ever come before you. No Chinese man was a leading man in Hollywood ever. What does it take to break that down? What does it take to go into a place where you are not welcome and no one like you has ever been welcome? What type of personality, what type of drive, what type of refuse to take no for an answer? What does that require? Certainly not for Quentin Tarantino to, decades later, judge a man for that. And it's the same way we look at Ronda. People, oh, she's arrogant. Oh, Ronda, the way she behaves, what she said, how she acted. It's those very things that allowed every single woman fighting in combat sports today to be there. On one hand, it required confidence, arrogance, a refusal to take no for an answer, a refusal to fail, a refusal to be put down, an absolute alpha mentality. That's what it took Bruce Lee to break through in Hollywood as a Chinese man in the 1970s. That's what it took Ronda Rousey to break through into a place where they had said no woman will ever come. That's what it took. And here we are. Years later, we're different people. We don't know what it was like. We don't know what it would be like to try to do that, and we judge. For my money, Ronda Rousey is the most important female fighter, one of the most important fighters ever, certainly in modern combat sports history, and I'm forever a fan. Thank you, Ronda, for all you did, and I'm sorry that there's a downside to it, but you and your husband and your kids and your family, I hope you know what you did, and I hope you're proud. When we come back, let's talk to a man who was there through the whole process, Coach Edmund Tarverdyan. When we come back, we're going to come back right now. Edmund Tarverdyan. Thank you for hanging with me, and thank you for chatting with us for the series Dark Side of the Cage. Have you seen any of the episodes?
Yeah, I watched some of it. Yeah, I watched the Diego one yesterday. I was watching it. Yeah, they sent me some links. Awesome. I like it.
Yeah, it's the Kimbo story. We loved
the
telling
Kimbo.
that
I watched
story.
too, not all of it, but I watched some of it, parts of it. Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah, from streets to, mainstream. Yeah, real arenas. That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, of course, we're talking about Ronda and her story. I mean, I'm a fan, right? I'm an unbiased, I'm biased. I'm a fan of Ronda. I have been. What she did, how she was able to pioneer fighting and get women fighting. What did you think the first day you met Ronda Rousey?
First day. And, I had a lot of fighters back then when she came in. They told me she's like, Olympic bronze medalist and, good judokai. But, in my head, I was like, I didn't think of her much. I didn't look at her. I didn't think a judokai could do what she, would do. Or there was no woman, of course, in the UFC. And we had fighters in the gym, fighting on Showtime, boxing, and world champion fighters. Victor Chinian. So we had big names in the gym. So they didn't even pay attention to her at all. So I didn't think of it much. I'm trying to think what I did think of her. So it was like, it's like a blank, something blank coming to me. Nothing, basically.
Well,
not much. But I remember some of the guys like Manny Gamburi and those guys saying, oh, she's an Olympic bronze medalist in judo. And maybe not so much just that word, Olympic bronze medalist. Mm-hmm. And, just move on to the next conversation, nothing about her much.
And that's an amazing truth. But there must be a moment where between having a busy gym and high level boxers fighting and some maybe she's a bronze medalist over there. And one day you notice. One day you're like, hey, wait a second, there's something going on. Do you remember that turning point?
Yeah. So she was coming, and then she got in an argument with me. That part I've already said, about training her, getting on the pads with her, and she's driving all that way. So after that, I started working with her. Then her first amateur fight, it was actually the manager at the time when he called me. I was around the area where they picked up a fight in a local gym, and it was a little gym fight, basically amateur fight. So when I went in, the way when I wrapped her hands and how excited she got and how she warmed up, and I saw her focus, her motivation to do this, and how her, her spirit, her intensity about getting in there and wanting to finish the fight and staying so focused during the warm up, and you know her attitude. Well, I was like, this girl's got something. When she went in there, and within seconds, just what I told her, she nailed it. Just move forward right away. Don't worry about them kicking or anything. Keep your hands tight and get in that clinch and do your judo and submit her. And she did that within seconds. And the way she pounded the cage with her legs, her feet jumping up and real focus. I was like, all right, this is like another Victor Chinian. I have but a girl version, real somebody that wants to finish the fight every second. So after that, I knew she was something special, which she has the fighting spirit, of course, and not afraid to fight. Actually, gets more excited and shines in that octagon when she gets in there. It's a they special fighters like that. I always say they like glow. In that octagon or in that ring. When they get in there, you see that the spirit is different.
Yeah.
They're fighters that want to do damage every second, basically. They're ready,
Yeah.
they're there to fight. So you're gonna have your hands full regardless, what the outcome of the fight, win or lose. But so she was one of those. I noticed that, and then of course all the other fights we picked up, and then going to Canada and getting the fight with Strike Force, getting a call and then getting in there.
Yeah.
So just started blowing up. Yeah.
So there's a few things I want to ask you about related to that. One is you've coached hundreds of fighters, low level, mid level, top level.
Yes.
100 fighters, even the great ones, 80 of them, have a hard time being close to their best in a fight. In a gym, they're better. 10 or 20 of them are better on fight night. Ronda was one of those. And is that an accurate statement, first of all?
Accurate
And if so,
statement.
yeah.
Accurate statement. Yeah, I was just talking about that yesterday. I have a kid just came down from Russia, and the kid is, when I watch him, I know that he's doing his 100% in that octagon, in the ring, wherever he's fighting at, and he doesn't know much. You know, his skills, I would grade it as a C. Like he knows maybe like 30-40% striking, but the kid goes for it and he strikes, and it's unbelievable. When I watched him, like, okay, you could do some damage, you could be a great fighter, and he's good. So I made some calls, and we'll get him out there soon. So, but some people have that. Some people have that. You see what ability they have. They do it 110%, 200, whatever you want to call it, in that octagon, in that ring. And some people are great in the gym, and when they get in there, they do the opposite. They give their 30-40% of what they have. So it's hard to see, but no, Ronda, of course, she was good in the gym, great in the octagon. Both. She was great in the gym and great in the octagon. So different mindset.
I remember, so I was speaking, I just kind of got to know Sean Shelby at the time. I had a fighter, I managed a young fighter named Nick Denny who had come up. And Sean and I were speaking, and he was telling me about Ronda. And I was saying, I don't know if I buy it. I don't know if and he's like, no, it's real. I said, I don't know. And then I saw her fight Sarah Kaufman. I'm from Canada, and I commentated lots of Sarah's fights. And Sarah was the baddest ass there was. And Ronda marched over, got the grip, got the position, got the throw, got the finish. And suddenly I'm like, oh shit, okay, it's real, right? It's real. And it was one of those things,
During that
suddenly
fight,
you
how
know it.
she bob and weaved using the triple double jab, and she bob and weaved under McMahon's, jab, and got her shoulder underneath her armpit and started, working her throw. she hasn't been boxing by that time. She wasn't been boxing professionally or like 5 6 years. You have boxers getting in there and they can't bob and weave and slip their way into the inside to start fighting on the inside. So she did that. That's what I'm saying. She had it naturally too. Some people
Yeah.
have it. So in
Yeah.
that instinct, her mind is working and she's going. It's natural. So
Yeah. Yeah. In your in your lifetime as a coach, and you've got many chapters ahead of you, have you I know the answer to this. We never saw this amount of attention around a fighter, right? And do you think you'll ever see that again, where suddenly you're around an audience that is so broad and they don't really, they're not even fight fans, they just become fans of this person? It must have been a wild thing to experience.
yeah, it was. I wish it happens again. Not with me, of course. I wish, but it is once in a lifetime. So I don't know who the next fighter would be, but during around this time, and then after we saw Conor McGregor do a lot of great things. But yeah, mainstream she is. When I witnessed that when we went out to Brazil and all those kids and all the people on the streets. Like really, like it was different. It was not only an athlete, it was a female doing something that men have a hard time doing, finishing fights like that, with that intensity, with that speed, power, with that nastiness, you want to call it. And how great she looked doing it. And yeah, I don't think I'll have another one, but I hope someone does. Yeah.
There aren't going to be many like that.
Yeah.
They sometimes when people become that big that fast, the audience turns on them, and I'm shocked. I don't know why, I don't know where it comes from, but there's a segment of the audience that for some reason dislikes her now. Do you see that, and does that make any sense to you?
I don't know. I think they want her more around. I think she could turn that around by being more around MMA, the UFC, and that will change. I think she could do that. I think that she's not around and she's not, in the sport much involved, and people do miss, and some talk, some don't. So, I think the dislike happens more there because people do miss her and they want her. That's what I believe. So it's the internet, is we know the internet, anybody could write anything. So, but
Yeah.
when she's around and she goes out, I mean, people love her. I've never seen her in so besides the internet, I think she's loved and everybody loves her. She's great. So, in the internet, those writings, I think some of them miss her and want her around. So it just, they just say something just because she's not out there anymore.
Yeah.
She wants to come out and be involved a little bit more with the fight game. They will love her. That's no problem. Everybody loses, everybody wins. I don't think there's a reason for anyone to dislike a champion that gave so much to the woman and to the sport. So what is there to dislike? It's not like she did anything personally to anybody's mom or dad. You know what I mean? It's
That's
like,
right.
why would you dislike her so much? It's like, all right, she said something you don't like, it's okay. Not everybody's gonna like everything you say, not everybody's gonna like everything I say, not everybody's gonna like what you say,
100%.
right? So that's
Yeah.
life. So I mean, there's not much we should hold on to, for each other and dislike each other for
100%.
those reasons. Yes.
Yeah, I told you Edmund would be fascinating, and I told you he was not like you expected based on whatever meme you may have heard about him 10 years ago. One aspect of Ronda Rousey's life and career that we look at in depth in Dark Side of the Cage, in the Ronda episode, is concussions, brain trauma. These are realities of fighting. So I want to bring in my dear friend, Dr. Faisal Rahman. Dr. Faisal is a martial artist himself. He's had pro fights of his own, and he is a cage-side physician at UFC events and other fighting events, and he is a professor and a doctor and just an all-around good dude. Let's bring him in. Dr. Faisal, my friend, it is very, very good to see you. How are you, sir?
Robin, great to see you. Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
I want to talk about Ronda Rousey. In particular, she spoke a lot about concussions and head injuries throughout her career as a judoka, a professional fighter, and a pro wrestler. You are a ringside physician, a doctor, a professor. Talk to me, and a martial artist, and you've had pro fights of your own. Talk to me about generalized thoughts about head trauma in professional fighting.
It's in general, I think it's a much more appreciated phenomenon now than what it used to be. But I would dare say, when Ronda was competing as an amateur in judo, I wonder what safety processes they had in place back then, because I suspect a lot of her injuries started as when she was a young woman competing in the sport, and I suspect she was competing since she was a very young, girl. And now as a woman who's competed in many different combat sports, including mixed martial arts, judo, even professional wrestling, all of those sports take a toll. And I think we're starting to get more appreciation of that in things like pro football and other sports. But in general, I'm so concerned that at those amateur levels, when we have our kids who are so young and so vulnerable, we're probably under recognizing concussions in many other sports. And I suspect by the time they come to the big leagues, they're already prone. They already have the substrate to be prone to more serious head injuries because of all the small concussions or small brain injuries they may have had coming up the way.
Rhonda's in her 30s. 25 years ago, a football coach, your judo coach, whomever might say, shake it off and get back in there, right? That was a common thing a couple of decades ago.
Oh, very common. I can even think when I was a young kid playing soccer when I was 6 or 7 years old, we'd be heading each other by mistake while going for the ball, and balls would hit us in the head, and you went to the sidelines for a little bit, but then you just brushed it off and you went right back in. And I think it was ignorance on the athlete's part. Obviously, we were just kids, but ignorance on our parents' part, ignorance on the coach's part. We just didn't, know a lot about it back then in the 80s, 1980s, 1970s, and 1980s. And even now, I'm still concerned that in many amateur sports, we still don't have that appreciation. I mean, hockey and football may be a bit different, but many other sports, I'm not sure. I mean, in boxing, for example, in amateur boxing, you could compete 3 or 4 times in one day, while you're in a tournament or going for the Olympic trials or competing at the nationals. You may compete multiple times a day, and you're taking headshots.
Yeah.
And often the athletes themselves, we're our own worst enemy, where we'll hide our injuries and so that we can go on and compete. And then our coaches and our therapists are not recognizing that perhaps we've been concussed, and so it leads to that vicious, second hit trauma, third hit trauma, that head trauma that our athletes are prone to. So I completely agree with you. There's lack of appreciation from athletes, from coaches, from parents, and from everyone.
Dr. Faisal, we hear fighters say, I can't really get into my fight until I've been hit a few times. And there are different reasons for that. But I had a concussion. It was undiagnosed, but there was no question. I had many when I was fighting, or some for sure. There was one that I know I had. I didn't see a doctor about it, but when I was hit during sparring, the moment after I was hit, presumably concussed, I was able to actually see the sparring round much more clearly. And I remember time slowing, and I was really sharp for the remainder of the round. That phenomenon is a real thing, correct? Sometimes in the moment of a concussive or a heavy subconcussive blow to the brain, we can actually become sharper. Is that true?
I don't know if we can become sharper. I don't necessarily believe that. What I believe is you've trained yourself to such an elite level. And Robin, I know how hard you trained when you were competing. Your body goes on autopilot. If I may give a personal experience, I was sparring at one of my local MMA gyms here. And in the 4th or 5th round of sparring, I took a shot just to the tip of my jaw, and I fell down. I was probably out for a couple of seconds, but I bounced right back up. I said, I'm okay. And then I sparred a full further round, and I competed, according to my coach, fairly well. I have no recollection of that. And in fact, after sparring, I forgot that my son was with me. I didn't know where I was. I thought it was October and it was April, and I was not making any sense. So an ambulance was called, and I went to the hospital. And 6 hours later, I was back to normal. And then I went to a 1980s dance party the same evening. What I'm saying is, I think our bodies go on autopilot. I have no recollection of that next round, and I think you might have recollection. You might even think you were super sharp, but I think it was just your own body being in elite shape, going on autopilot, and you're slipping punches, you're kicking, and if, to anybody watching you, if anyone people who were watching that last round of sparring after I'd been knocked out would think that I was kind of normal, but really what had happened was I was badly concussed. When I went to the hospital, I had no recollection of where I was, and I had an urgent CAT scan, and I was in hospital for about 6 or 7 hours before being discharged. So I think our bodies go on autopilot.
You work as a ringside physician at fights, including the UFC, and you are a lover of martial arts, and you compete yourself. But as a doctor, truthfully, this is an incredibly dangerous thing that we do. And sometimes we forget that, or in our presentation of it, we forget to mention it. But this is an incredibly dangerous endeavor, isn't it?
Very dangerous sport, but I love it. And I think we love it, and the fans of the sport love it. There's no getting around. I can't argue with a neurosurgeon or neurologist saying, you know what, I think the sport should be banned. What are we doing? But the art of fighting, the beauty of the martial art, the beauty of the movement of the body, the reaction time, the warrior spirit, the overcoming the odds, it's a very, very attractive sport for many of us for that reason. Both men and women love the sport for that reason. And I think rather than get into a moralistic debate about it, which I would lose with anyone, I think we just want to be in the situation where we make the sport as safe as possible to help preserve the beautiful things about the sport, the opportunities the sport gives to people who are up and coming in the sport, who may come from disadvantaged parts of our society, for example. It does so much positive for charity and so much positive stuff for our community. I think people forget that, but there's no doubt in my mind, as you said, we can't beat around the bush. It's a dangerous sport. It puts people's lives at risk. But I think it's the jobs of those of us who love the sport, to try to conduct it in such a manner that it's as safe as possible. Again, we've talked about this before. You can say the same thing for football, for hockey, for soccer, where there are significant head injuries as well. I mean, are we gonna ban those sports because of those risks? Of course not. But we want to try to make the sport as safe as possible.
How familiar are you with her story as she tells it, about injuries young and then injuries fighting in the UFC and competing while possibly concussed or otherwise affected by head trauma? How familiar are you with her story?
I really admire Ronda for what she's said about what she's going through. And again, post-concussion syndrome is a real phenomenon. And I just want to say this because I'm very passionate about it, that it is underappreciated by the workplace. It is underappreciated by medical societies and by insurance companies and by the workplace especially, because I've seen a number of our own Canadian athletes having severe post-concussion syndrome whose own work will get in the way, in fact, be an obstruction to them getting the care they need, despite being having severe head injuries. And so it was wonderful for Ronda to speak about what she went through, because it makes other athletes going through that know that they're not alone. The depression, the anxiety disorder, the feeling life is not worth living, losing purpose in life. And thankfully with Ronda, after she suffered a number of bad injuries in the UFC against Holly Holmes and others, she felt the impact of post-concussion syndrome to its fullest. And luckily, honestly, had a very good support from her husband and other families to be able to get through that. But you go into a dark place. I had one patient, he's an MMA fighter, who is no longer competing, but had such severe post-concussion syndrome. He was having visions, violent visions. He would not mind me sharing this with you, but visions of hurting his family and visions of dark things that are very well documented part of post-concussion syndrome. And so people need to be able to share what they're going through, need to be able to access care. The workplace needs to be more understanding of what athletes and others go through who have head injuries and post-concussion syndrome. And I think Ronda's story is only going to help bring awareness to this because we need athletes like her to speak up.
My friends, thank you so much for hanging out with me. I want to thank Coach Edmund Tarverdyan. I want to thank Dr. Faisal Raymond. I want to thank you for hanging out. There's only 2 more episodes in season 1 of Dark Side of the Cage. It's 2 more podcasts. But much love. Until next time, enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
Ronda Rousey.
First female champion of the UFC.
She's the one going on The Tonight Show.
Every fight that she won, she finished. Why would this be any different?
I couldn't believe that Ronda Rousey could lose the fight.
It was a moment of this silence.
I didn't see that happening.
It was too much.
If you do this sport, you're going to get concussed.
That's a lot of brain trauma.
Ronda hid the fact that she experienced these concussions.
It was very tough because I made a promise.
What was the promise?
That she'll never lose.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.